So introduction to Angular 2456. So first of all, in order to create dynamic applications on the client side, we have a programming language called JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language used to perform DOM manipulations. What is the meaning of DOM manipulations? If you want to update a text box or if you want to update a paragraph or something, we have to directly access that particular text box or paragraph element programmatically, and we have to assign the value directly. So you are trying to interact with the HTML tags directly through program. That is the main meaning of DOM manipulations. Here DOM stands for document object model. It is the tree structure of the element. So whichever the HTML tags are present in your web page, like paragraph or headings or tables, text boxes, anything, we are able to operate them directly. That is called DOM manipulations. If you perform DOM manipulations, the problem is, since the code directly depends on DOM, if the developer makes any changes to DOM, for example, in design you can have some modification, right? The programming code needs to be updated or needs to be changed. Here there are two aspects. One is designing, another one is programming. Designing means suppose you want to make your login form. How do you make the login form look like that? How do you place the box? How do you place the username label, text box, password label, then password text box, submit button? So it's all about designing. Once the designing is completed, functionality comes into picture. Functionality means some code is required. Suppose if you click on the login button, checking the username and password and displaying the appropriate message based on the input. So this is called some programming related. Designing is different, programming is different. The problem is, if you modify the DOM, since the program depends on the DOM, if you modify the DOM, the program also needs to be changed. DOM is updated means, for example, you have added one more text box, or we have removed some existing text box. We have modified the place of the text box from one place to another place. If the DOM changes, the code also needs to be changed. So this is the practical problem we have. That's why for the large projects, the plain use of the JavaScript is not recommended. Almost no project is being done only with JavaScript. Most of the people use any one of the advanced flavor of JavaScript, either jQuery or Angular or React. Any one of these combination is used, either jQuery or Angular or React. Or there are some other different ways also. For example, Backbone.js, Ember.js. These are the different other ways. JavaScript libraries. jQuery, one of the most popular JavaScript library. It is providing some shortcut functions to perform DOM manipulations. That means if you want to access the paragraph, if you want to access the text box, if you want to access any HTML tag and try to update its value, some shortcut functions available. Through these shortcut functions, you are able to perform the DOM manipulations. With less amount of code, we can bring more output. So even though code is reduced with the help of jQuery, still the problem continues. So since the code depends on the DOM, we cannot if the DOM is changes, that means if the designing changes, the programming also needs to be updated. So we don't want the direct dependency of the programming upon the DOM. The DOM should be independent of programming should be independent of DOM. Even designing should be done by one developer and programming should be done by another developer. We want separation also. So for this requirement, the plain use of the JavaScript or JavaScript library is also not recommended. It is recommended to use any one framework. Now let's talk about JavaScript frameworks. Here we have several options like Angular or AngularJS, two options. Otherwise you can go for React, or you can say React.js, and you can say Knockout.js. Like this, we have several options like Backbone.js and all this. So if you take the first generation like AngularJS, okay, Knockout.js, etc., I will maintain the sequence. Okay, this could be the correct sequence. Even you can say Ember.js also. So if you take this first part, it is implementing some architecture here. The architecture is either MVC architecture or MVVM architecture, whereas AngularJS supports MVC architecture, model view controller architecture. And if you take this Ember.js supports MVC architecture, and Knockout.js supports MVVM architecture. What do you mean by architecture? The architecture is providing the pictorial representation of the components. Means how do you divide your code into multiple parts? How do you arrange them neatly? And when which code should be called? For example, MVC says that model view controller 3 parts. So view has to call the model, controller has to call the model. This type of rules and regulations also specified by the architecture. So AngularJS and Ember.js supports MVC architecture. Knockout.js supports MVVM architecture, model view, view model. But actually the generation is getting down. Nowadays the generation is a components generation. Instead of architecture generation, components generation is better. React.js supports components, Angular also supports components. Here I mentioned AngularJS separately, Angular separately. AngularJS was in the first type, that is architecture based, either MVC architecture or MVVM, whatever. But Angular is separate. It is components based. That is a major difference between them. What is the advantage of supporting components and how it is different from architecture based? In this case of MVC architecture, we are trying to combine, we are trying to separate the data storage and the data processing as two different points. Data will be stored in the model. Data processing or calculations or checking the conditions, etc. will be done by the controller. For example, you take the login form. Login form details are what? Username and password. You will store the username and password in the model. M for model. Model contains username and password. The controller will check the username and password correct or not. In case of correct, what data should be displayed to user. In case of incorrect, what data should be displayed. All this processing done by the controller. Understand? The data stored by model, data processed by controller, data presented by user, view. But in case of components, we are trying to combine the data and the process. So we can picture it as like this. Model about stores data. Here data means in the login form, for example, username and password. And view displays data. It's all about a design. Generally, we can assume the login form design, obviously. So the username password with a text box. That is a design. That is a design in the view. And the controller manipulates data. Manipulation means all kinds of processing. For example, you want to check the username and password correct or not. You want to do some calculations. You want to send a request to server. So all these kind of activities are done by the controller. So this is the manipulation related logic, or you can say programming logic. So programming logic is controller, presentation logic is view, only storage is model. This MVC architecture preferred in Angular and Ember.js also. AngularJS, not Angular, AngularJS. When it comes to React.js and Angular, we can say components based. Our present course is about Angular, it's not AngularJS. So we have to focus on this point. It's all about components. In Angular 2, 4, 5, 6 course, we never see the MVC architecture implementation. If you go back to AngularJS, which was the old version, which is less used in these days, we were using MVC architecture in that old generation. But in Angular 2, 4, 5, 6, we have to use components based approach. What is the meaning of components based approach? It's really simple to understand. So one component is equal to some data plus processing, manipulation logic. So data we will store plus manipulation logic also we will store. So data plus manipulation logic are coupled together, that is equal to the component. Every component will be associated to a template, whereas template is equal to the view. So the view is termed as a template here. So view contains a presentation logic. Template also contains the presentation logic. Component is equal to the data and the manipulation logic. So that's the difference between the MVC architecture and the components based approach. Actually, React.js was the first successor of the components based approach. Angular follows the React.js in the components based approach, but it is supporting much more than what it is not supported by React.js. Means React.js supports only the concept of components, mainly supports the components, but it is not focusing on other areas of the client-side programming, such as it is not constant on the routing, it is not constant on the validations or services development or module development, etc. But Angular, it also supports component-based approach development, and also it's supporting some additional features, additional advanced features such as modules, services, directives, pipes, routing, Ajax. That means API calls, you can say. Means we are going to call the server-side API. And material design means we are trying to have some built-in ready-made buttons or ready-made text boxes, ready-made look and feel of the components. Instead of you apply the CSS styles yourself, you can make use of some ready-made CSS styles. So all these are done by this Angular. Since Angular is providing almost everything that a common client-side developer requires, Angular is mostly preferred. So even though there are some other ways to substitute the requirements in React.js, for example, there is a way of routing in React.js, there is a way of Ajax calls in React.js, but we have to depend on some third-party tools or third-party packages in case of React.js. But Angular is like a complete power pack. It supports almost everything which is required by the client side. server side we can use Java or .NET or PHP, it's up to you. Angular fits for any server side, it doesn't matter. So client side, almost everything provided by Angular. That's why most of the people like to use Angular. That's why this much demand available for Angular. So Angular has two versions. Not, you cannot say Angular or Angular JS. Just confused actually. So let's call it as Angular JS Angular, okay? Because the first version is Angular JS, second version is Angular, okay? First version is Angular JS, second one is Angular. Angular JS different, Angular is different. So Angular JS 1, we can say Angular JS 1. Angular JS 2 is not there. Angular JS 2, Angular JS 4 never be there. Angular 1 never be there. Angular directly starts from Angular 2, or you can say Angular 4, Angular 5. Recently, Angular 6 is going to release. Just RC version is released. Full version is not released yet. Just maybe within a 1 or 2 weeks, they will release Angular 6 also. Okay, it is under development right now. As of now, stable version is Angular 5 only. So Angular 1 never be there. Angular JS 2 never be there. So there are two different frameworks there. The name really confused the people actually. When the Angular 2 was initially released in the beginning, the people confused like, okay, it's a new version of Angular, so maybe all the existing features of Angular JS 1 repeats in Angular, and some advancements, maybe some improvements or bug fixing, maybe that the people expect like this. But Angular 2 is not an extension to AngularJS 1. It's complete rebuilt from the scratch. AngularJS and Angular has no any conceptual similarities between each other. It's entirely different, starting from the model of development, starting from the architecture, starting from the libraries or language. To take any aspect, some common words you may find, but concepts are entirely different. Words may be common. For example, there is a word called services in AngularJS 1 and Angular 2 also, but concepts are entirely different. Like that, common words may be fine, but implementation of or usage are entirely different. So for the developer perspective, there are two different frameworks. Even the name may be same, but two different frameworks. So in case of old projects only, the people are preferring AngularJS 1, but for the latest projects, mostly Angular 2, Angular only used. So our course covers Angular only, doesn't cover AngularJS 1. There is very less preference for AngularJS 1 in these days. Nobody willing to learn AngularJS 1 right now. So Angular 2 is mostly preferred. So there are so many job openings for Angular 2, not for AngularJS. So the people are obviously go for that. But our course covers Angular 2 plus. 2 plus means 2 onwards, Angular 2, 4, 5. 3 is skipped. You may think about 3, but 3 is skipped. I will tell that reason also later, slowly, don't worry. So Angular 3 is skipped. Angular 2 onwards, everything will be explained. But surprisingly, Angular 2, 4, 5, 6 having very minor changes. Small bug fixes, performance improvements, compilation model different. This type of features only different, but mostly 95% same in between Angular 2 up to Angular 6 also. Even if any developer learned Angular 2 previously, he can easily understand Angular 4, 5, 6, anything. Very small changes are there. That's almost ignorable. Anyway, I will provide the deep coverage of the differences of these versions later in the further lessons, maybe at the end of the class, the end of the course. So generally, if you observe from the top level, no much differences between these versions. And another thing is that AngularJS 1 knowledge is not at all required for understanding Angular 2. You can directly start with Angular 2 if you have knowledge of JavaScript. JavaScript is entry point for both of these. If you know JavaScript, then only you can go for either AngularJS 1 or Angular also. Starting from JavaScript, directly you can go to AngularJS. Or directly you can go to Angular. AngularJS 1 knowledge is not required for Angular. If you already know, that's okay. If you don't know also, better actually. If you don't know AngularJS 1, very easily you can understand Angular, because if you know that, it will make some confusion and comparison and confusion actually. And another difference is about the language. In AngularJS 1, the name itself is saying that JavaScript we have to use. In Angular, TypeScript we have to use. But TypeScript is what? Superset of JavaScript. Means all the same JavaScript concepts as it is should be used. In addition to that, some extra concepts are added. I can give one simple formula like TypeScript is equal to JavaScript plus classes plus interfaces plus some other additional features.